This is BTEC Applied Psychology. This is Unit 3, Section C1, where we're looking at theories of persuasion. And this particular model is called the Elaboration Likelihood Model. And the idea of this model, in a nutshell, is that people who are prepared to really think about an issue that they're being, that they're hearing a message about, if they're prepared to really think about something and process it, then they're more likely to be persuaded and change their behaviour. So this is like the sentence of it in a nutshell. The degree of persuasion and attitude change that someone will have depends on the likelihood that they will devote mental effort to elaborate, i.e. think about and process the information that they receive about an issue or product. If they're willing to or likely to process an issue thoroughly, then they're much more likely to be persuaded and to change their behaviour. So what this means is there are two routes to persuading people. The first route is called the peripheral route. This is when someone's unlikely to be listening or not motivated to listen. Like, for example, if you were to give me a message about cars, I would have probably not very much interest in listening. And in that case, you use the peripheral route, which is basically attention-grabbing, really simple messages where you're trying to sort of slap them around the face with something obvious to grab their attention. If they're likely, on the other hand, to be able to listen to and process and be interested in the message, then we use what's called the central route, which is where you give details, you give facts, you give well-reasoned arguments, and then they're more likely, as a result of that kind of message, if they're listening and likely to listen and process, they're more likely to change their behaviour. So those are our two routes to persuasion. So this is just a different diagram of it. You can see at the top, I like this diagram because it shows a continuum. We've kind of got it in two boxes, haven't we? But everyone will fall somewhere on this continuum. It won't be either like they're totally highly motivated or they're not motivated at all. Actually, most people will probably be somewhere in the middle. However, what we've got is where someone's not motivated or they've got low motivation or ability to elaborate. What you use are these sorts of different tactics, things like simple slogans, association with nice things, so like celebrities and things like that are often used for that kind of persuasion. And then when you've got high motivation or ability to elaborate, you've got these sorts of reasoned arguments and someone who's going to consciously think about pros and cons. Okay, let's unpack those a little bit more. For the central route, you're more likely to get long-lasting behavioural change because someone is listening carefully and they're processing the different arguments that you're making. They're likely to process them for one or more than one of these different reasons that I've listed. For example, if the issue has personal relevance, like for example, if you were hearing an argument about whether schools should stay open or not during the coronavirus, that would have personal relevance for you. It affects you right now. They have a high need for cognition. That just means like the amount that someone enjoys doing like complex, effortful activities or kind of thinking. So someone that really likes thinking through things or doing complex puzzles and that sort of thing. That's someone who has a high need for cognition. And if that's and that makes them more likely to be persuaded well by a central route argument. Equally, if they're uncertain about the issue, they're more likely to elaborate and process it. And if they're not distracted or busy, of course, they're less likely to process it if they are distracted or busy. If we take peripheral route on the other hand, this is an example of a peripheral route advert on the right hand side. That's a simple attention grabbing, let's associate Diet Coke with a very beautiful celebrity. Then peripheral factors are used to grab the attention. So yeah, things like celebrity endorsements, creating a nice mood to fit with the brand. People are unlikely to really think about the issues, or they're not interested, they're busy, it's not personally relevant to them, and those are the sorts of times when you might use a peripheral route message. I've just left these in as two quite nice examples. On the left, what you've obviously got here is a peripheral route message. It's designed, the naked woman, designed to completely grab attention. On the right, what you've got is a central route advert where you've got clear, well, it's sort of a central route advert, but it's far more factual. It's giving arguments, it's giving facts, and so you can see this sort of distinction between them: the kind of simple attention grabbing slogan versus the I'm going to present you with a fact kind of persuading advert. Okay, let's have a look at some evaluation for this particular model. First of all, it has practical applications. I mean, you can make this point with all these models, of course, but it can make health messages more persuasive, thinking about the fact that you're doing a health unit here. Anything that we find that can help us to understand how to persuade people is always going to help us to persuade people to give up smoking, persuade people to follow a program to give up addiction, and so on and so on and so on. So it's really helpful. It can have a big impact on health if we can be persuading people to change their lifestyle, to reduce obesity and so on. So the model has practical applications. Second strength is that it's supported by research, so it's not just some pie-in-the-sky argument. We've got evidence that supports it, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then if we talk about weaknesses, it only really describes what's happening. So it's saying that if you're not interested, you're more likely to be persuaded by that. But it's not really explaining why it's happened. It's just saying that this is what happens. So what it would be interesting to know is, why are people who have a high need for cognition more persuaded by this sort of argument? So it would be helpful to have a bit more explanation behind it. The other thing is that it's complex and has got lots of different factors in it. How do you know which particular factor is making the difference? Is it that they're not? Is it that they're busy, or is it that they're they've got a lower need for cognition, or is it that it's personally relevant? What in particular is making the difference? So it's not useful in some ways, because you can't. What we really want is a model that's clear enough that you could say, oh, so if I give this advert to this person, they'll be highly likely to change. It's not as good as that. It's not as clear as that, because it's got too many things in it. Right, let's have a look at this. This is your key study for this particular topic, Petty et al. 1981, and this is a piece of research which is really looking at issues linked to the elaboration likelihood model. So the question that they looked at is, do we elaborate more thoroughly through the central route if an issue is directly relevant? And if it's not directly relevant, do we elaborate less thoroughly through the peripheral route? So it really focused on the elaboration likelihood model. So let's have a look at what they did. This was carried out on students at a university, and they were told, this was early in their year group, they were told that the university was going to be changed, and that they would have to have a new comprehensive exam that they would have to pass in order to graduate. And they were told basically, each of the groups of students was given a message which was slightly different, and then it was measured to see how much they agreed with the idea of the new exam. So one thing that they looked at was what we have here was is it personally relevant to them or not? So some students were told this comprehensive exam will be introduced next year, which obviously would affect them if they were currently a student, and some were told it will be introduced in 10 years' time, i.e. it's not going to be personally relevant for them. So they're looking to see the difference between the groups. Are the ones who are saying it will be introduced next year, are they going to pay more attention to the arguments and really process it or not? That's the question. And then the second thing that they looked at in this key study was who was delivering it. Has it come from an expert or a non-expert? What's the expertise of the source? Are they going to really pay attention to this? This links to the whole idea of who's presenting it. Don't get this muddled with the other models that we've looked at, the source, the message stuff. Try and make sure that you've linked this idea to, if you've got you're going to pay on a peripheral route, you're going to pay perhaps more attention to who's presenting it. For example, if a celebrity's used or whatever. Let's have a look at the last factor that they looked at, which was basically how strong the message was. So some people got like quite a factual presentation with really strong arguments, and other people got what they called weak arguments, which was more about like, this is my opinion. So there were three things there that they looked at. Is it personally relevant? Who presented it, and did that make a difference? And then how strong were the arguments involved? So what they then found was people who had a high personal involvement, so it was directly relevant for them, the quality of the argument made a really big difference, but the expertise made no difference. So for those people, that suggested that they were really, really listening to the arguments and processing them. And actually, they weren't paying that much attention to who was delivering it. But then for people for whom it wasn't personally relevant, the quality of the argument didn't really have any effect on them. But they did pay attention to whether it was like an expert presenting it or not, whether it was like a professor of education at Princeton University or whether it wasn't. That made a difference to those people. So they were kind of saying, oh, well, this is an expert, so I can kind of go with their opinion. If you think about it, that's much lower level of processing than the others who are really thinking, oh, this is educationally beneficial because blah, 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 blah. So for those people with the low personal involvement, the conclusion was that they're not processing it, and so that's when you need like more of a peripheral route. That's really a peripheral factor, just looking at the person who's presenting the information. Whereas the conclusion for the other group, when an issue is important to someone, they will engage in thoughtful processing of the message itself and not paying attention to other factors, suggesting a central route of persuasion is going to be more relevant. So just some brief evaluation of that study, since it's a key study. The positive, again, practical applications. Weaknesses, we've got university students was our sample. So first of all, that's obviously not a widely representative sample consisting of many different members of the population, but also particularly because university students often do have a greater need for cognition. They many university students are quite academic and like to think things through and really understand complex arguments. So that could suggest that might be affecting the results, and that actually they ought to carry the same experiment out on a wider range of people, including those who don't have a high need for cognition, to see if that makes any difference. Another problem is that this particular study hasn't been replicated. There was a 2007 study that tried and used younger children, but it found that personal involvement made no difference. So that's suggesting that perhaps we might not be able to generalize the results to other settings. Again, you could say further research is really needed into this factor. The last problem is that it used self-report to when they were giving their answers at the end to measure how much their attitudes had changed. So that it would have been through questionnaires and so on. So and ratings. In fact, they had to rate the concept of comprehensive exams, and they had to rate the extent to which they agreed with the proposal about the comprehensive exam. So actually, they could be affected in that by demand characteristics, what they think the experiment expects of them. They could be affected by social desirability bias. They don't want to say like, oh, I don't think it's any good, because they don't want people to think badly of them. So all of that might affect how valid the data is. And so that's a bit of a problem for the study, really. So there you go, 1 strength, 3 weaknesses. That's the elaboration likelihood model.